Buffers are some of the most misunderstood effects as it relates to guitar pedals and pedal boards, in addition to signal routing. Although we've been making videos about buffers and how to qualify them for many years, it still seems to be a recurring question that we get, especially on our DIY content about signal paths, whether buffer X or buffer Y is a good quality buffer, and also the use cases for buffers and how to understand if you're dealing with a quality buffer versus something that you might need to supplement with. Now, a good buffer, by the definition of what a buffer should do, firstly has no color, has no sound of its own. What comes in, goes out, it converts the signal to low impedance on the output, and it has a high impedance input to load the guitar, similarly to what you would get if you plugged a guitar directly into your favorite amplifier. That's typically a 1 meg input impedance, so the buffer should reflect that same input impedance of a normal tube amp if you want your guitar to behave the same way that it normally would, again, with a 10-foot cable into the amp. That should be the baseline, the reference point to use to compare quality buffers. Secondly, the buffer should be able to drive a long length of cable without any degradation. That means that it's not changing the tone, even if it's driving, let's say, 40, 50, or 100 feet or more of cable in the best case scenario. Thirdly, a buffer should have no EQ change. There shouldn't be any added compression, added highs, boosted mids, low end roll off. None of that should be present. Again, what comes in is what comes out. Now, many of us believe that because we have a pedal on our pedal board, which has a buffered bypass, which means when the pedal is off, there is still some active circuitry conditioning the line, that is equivalent to using a high quality, well-made buffer. And I'm here to tell you that probably fewer than 5% of the pedals out there that have a buffered bypass are buffers that you even want to play with. They're fine if you're going to have them on a pedal board and they're just driving individual cables between effects. But as far as driving a 20 or more foot cable out to your amp from your pedal board, or as far as loading the guitar on the input of the pedal board to make that guitar see the exact same impedance that it would see if you were plugged into your favorite amp, they're not that great at doing that, and often are not built by pedal builders that are building rigs. The pedal builders build pedals, the rig builders build rigs, and typically never the two shall meet. And so there's not exactly a standard around the quality of the buffers that are inside pedals. Most people are replicating existing designs that have been in existence for years, the Boss style, JFET, or BJT style buffers. And these are okay, again, if you're just driving little patch cables between pedals. But when you put any amount of capacitance or any long lengths of cable after them and you want them to drive them to your amp without any color, good luck. So today I want to show what the consequences are of using these standard buffer pedals that many of us think are doing the job of a buffer, and compare them to an actual standalone buffer, in this case being our Vertex buffer interface. Today, to do this test, to show how a quality buffer compares to these standard pedal-based buffers, we're going to take a true bypass looper from our friends over at GigRig, which has multiple loops that are fully bypassable, no active circuitry, and we're going to put a Klon Centaur in one, which is a revered buffer that many people seem to like and believe is a great quality buffer. We're going to have a Boss pedal, a latest Wazacraft version of a DC2. This is going to be representative of the common Boss style buffers. They really haven't changed very much over the years, so this will be fairly representative of what you'd find in a Boss tuner and many of the other effects. We're going to have an Ibanez Tube Screamer. Then we're going to have the Vertex buffer interface, just using one of the many buffers that's inside of it in one loop. And then we're going to have a loop that's representing all of the cable capacitance that you might ordinarily find on a pedal board. I've wired up 40 feet of Mogami 2314 as sort of the example amount of patch cable. And then I have a short 3-foot cable coming out of the GigRig True Bypass Looper going to the amp. So as a baseline, we're going to get to hear the guitar with a 10-foot cable going into the quartermaster, all the loops in bypass, and then a 3-foot cable to the amp. That's going to be our reference point. That's how things should sound with a fairly short cable length, minimal capacitance. Then we are going to add in one of the buffered pedals one at a time in addition to the 40 feet of cable capacitance. So you can hear the effect of how well these buffers inside of these pedals are able to drive a standard length of cable that you might find on a pedal board, and how that affects the tone comparatively to the next buffer pedal. So we're just going to go one at a time. I'm going to play the same exact sequence. We're going to get to hear some individual notes and some chords, and that way we can really calibrate how the original guitar sound compares to each one of these buffers and which one represents the tone most neutrally. Again, with the gold standard being guitar cable into amp with nothing in between. So let's plug in and let's see the results. Now, as somebody just sitting here and listening, playing the exact same piece, playing to a click track so I could stay as locked in as possible. Again, using a looper pedal in this situation, which I know some people have chimed in the past, would be problematic in that the output of a looper is low impedance. So you would be using whatever buffer is in the looper, feeding all of these buffer devices. So it wouldn't be actually a true test of the buffer alone in those pedals. So that's why I had to physically play for every single example. So just a FYI on that one. Obviously, there's going to be people that have a preference for a sound of something. But my opinion in building rigs, and having done so for many of the top professionals in the industry, is that we don't want the buffer to be a place where color is being induced into the signal path. If you like a darker signal, that's fine, but don't do it as a consequence of something that's permanent on the pedal board. If you want to darken your signal, you can get a longer cable going into the input. If you have passive pickups like what are in the Stratocaster, these are not going to be particularly efficient at driving long cable lengths as it is. So if I use a higher capacitance cable than, say, a Mogami, or I use a longer cable length or a coily cable, that's going to automatically darken my sound, but isn't going to put anything on the pedal board at jeopardy by trying to create a darker sound. By contrast, if you want a brighter sound, you can also do that. If I used a George L cable right here, but I recommend soldering it, it would brighten up the sound quite a bit because the sound of that cable has a totally different EQ. And there are other ways to get around trying to voice or shape your tone that don't include messing with the buffers. And so what I would recommend that anybody do who's building a pedal board is use the highest quality buffer that you can afford. If you really want to optimize all the beautiful and expensive pedals that you've already purchased and put on your board, you want to invest in that quality buffer so that you are getting the most out of everything that's there, that you're not losing any signal, that you're representing the sound that's coming out of the guitar fully through the pedal board out into the amp, and that you're not getting any coloration, loss, compression, the things that we heard that were consequential to the other pedals that we demonstrated and how well they're effectively able to drive that cable. And I think that 40 foot, even though you might say, well, that's kind of longer than what I would use on my pedal board. And my response to that would be, if you're considering all of the inner wiring of your pedals, the foot switches, which all have a capacitance and a resistance, and all the little things that are going in between the input and output jack in every single pedal, this is probably somewhat close to what you'd be dealing with in terms of all the different consequences and capacitive buildup that's occurring through each one of the effects. Of course, you may have some other buffers that are added in there by way of other buffer pedals or pedals that are turned on. But I think that this is a fairly close approximation to what most of us would be using when we're considering length of cable to get back to the amp from the pedal board, all the inner wiring of all the pedals, plus all the interconnections and connectors, because every quarter-inch jack has a capacitance with it as well, which is usually at least equivalent to a foot or two of cable. So I hope that this video was somewhat enlightening to you as it relates to buffers. We have several other videos that go into more detail around buffer signal path and overall pedalboard signal path, which I'll link below. We also will have links to our buffer interface if you're interested, as well as a recommended list of buffers that we think are good quality. Also, I'll link a DIY buffer if you want to save the money and do it yourself. There is a company called Creation Audio Lab that has a wonderful DIY buffer, and I've given diagrams and shown explicit installation instructions so that you too can build a high quality buffer, save the money by doing it yourself. I provide a full parts list, so you have an economical way to build a high quality buffer as well if you want to try that out. I really appreciate you watching. I hope this gives some more context to why you wouldn't want to just say, well, I have a Klon, or I have a Klon clone, so I don't need a buffer, or I have a Boss tuner, so I don't need a buffer, or I have a tube screamer, so I don't need a buffer. I have fill in the blank pedal that has a buffer in it, so I don't need a buffer. Those do have buffers, but the quality of the buffer matters. Just having a buffer doesn't mean anything about how good it is, how efficient it is at driving the line. And we can see here just using common buffer circuits that a lot of buffers are based on, or a lot of people have representative pedals of, are not sufficient when you compare it to a standalone high quality buffer like the Vertex buffer interface and some of the other ones that we'll list in the description for you to check out on your own. Until next time, I am Mason Marangella, aka the Rig Doctor from Vertex Effects. We will see you next time.